as an email or so that's great. And let me also say that I see this mostly as a group discussion because you all know a lot. I've been very impressed with who you are, what you learn, what you know, what you're doing. And that's why it's especially nice to see you. So let me.
And while you are looking for the presentation, I think that we want to say that we're very honored that you accepted our invitation to be with us and taking some time to explain to us how we can create this beautiful economy where we improve the well-being of everybody and take care of the planet.
Yeah. Oh, that's my pleasure. And I look forward to learning from you. Let me just say that a lot of people will ask, we can talk about what policies we'd like to have and how do you create a system of policies and what countries are doing it. So that's one thing we can document and talk about. But what we can't talk about, especially in the US, which I'll just tell you, of a list of 50 countries, if you rank them, which we do, according to sort of what I think of as a Buddhist economy, actually it's called, and for the data we've created, a Sustainable Shared Prosperity Policy Index. Because there have been lots of indices for outcomes or performance by country, and they're all very helpful and good. But when I was out talking about my Buddhist economics book and Buddhist economics, everybody would always say, well, what country's doing this? And I'd say, well, most people think of Northern Europe or Scandinavian countries, but every country is doing some things good and some things that could improve. And so I said, come on, I can do better than that. I can go back and we'll create a research team. And I did that, gee, it's been about 5 years ago now, where we started creating a policy index, not a performance or outcome index, across all sort of what we thought as the different parts of the economy. And so you'll see that later in more detail. And yeah, the Scandinavian countries are at the top. Europe in general is at the top, the EU, especially the old EU, the older countries, and because they're richer and have tried very hard to sort of take care of the people in general. But the US, out of 50 countries, we're like number 36 overall. Now we have some strong policies and we have lots of weak policies. So it's like, if you want to ask me, what do you do in the US? And it's like right now, I think, well, we can't reelect Trump. I mean, it's almost like, what can we do to not get worse and to move forward? It's I am really discouraged by the US, and I sort of envy the people in Canada. And Canada is quite a bit better than the US. Although I don't remember that
Professor
number.
Brown, can I ask you to expand a little bit in what you call, I understand, but perhaps it would be good, what you call policy index and performance index?
Oh, so performance index are the things that we usually see, such as a Human Development Index by the UN and the Sustainable Development Index. There are quite a few of those, and we look at 7 of them, and then there's some that are just mostly on the ecological index, but we have these 7 indices are really good, and they're across countries, and they're trying to tell you how well countries are doing. And none of these are the GNP. They're all truly what they think of. How do we want to look and see how countries are performing for well-being of people, which is what I care about and what you all care about. So we can compare countries that way, but then what we wanted to do was to actually look at, you can actually collect data on the policies that these different countries have. Like, for example, what's their minimum wage? What's the health and safety requirements in the workplace? Those are 2 workplaces. There's like, what are their regulations on protecting marine life or the biodiversity on the land. What are those policies? And because they do have policies. Now, whether or not how well they're implemented or how well they're actually enforced is a different story. And I can't answer that, but at least we can start off with, here are the policies, and we can compare them to the country's outcome or their performance. So, and we have like 60 policies, but I'll get to that. I just wanted to give you the overview of sort of where I was coming from, and what I care about right now is how do we create this economy that we all want and desperately need. And some countries are doing much better than others and even setting it up. And one of the things I really like about a policy index is you can go in and start looking at policies as opposed to, here's what's happening there. And so let me just quickly run through my slides. The first 10 slides I'm going to run through very quickly. I just want you to understand what I think of as a Buddhist economy, which has, let me see if I can share screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
So let me do presentation on it. There, how's that?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Let me, okay. So, whoops. So, as you all know, the biggest problem is we're living in multiple crises. And for me, the biggest crisis is the climate crisis. Before, when I was younger, I've been around the block a few times, I really focused on inequality and reducing inequality. And this is what got me interested in policy. We knew the policies. In the US, we kept telling the government, if you want to reduce inequality, which was growing like crazy, especially since the 80s, here are the policies. We know they work because we've studied them in other countries, especially the Northern European countries. But inequality was going up, and pretty much the politics trumped economics. Oops, sorry for using that word. But we didn't get anywhere. And so I looked at my colleagues at Berkeley and MIT, especially where many of us were studying inequality policies or how to bring it down or what was causing it. And we finally said, we cannot afford to lose so badly in the climate crisis. We're killing the earth, and we really do need to stop overheating the atmosphere and thus the planet. And on top of that, we've been living in a time where wars seem to be increasing, not decreasing. And we have a lot of authoritarian dictatorships, even replacing countries that were somewhat more democratic. So to me, though, we really do have to study the climate crisis because it's in the short term, we can actually end life on the planet as we know it. So all of you know that Buddhist economics has interdependence. But there are three main assumptions, not just interdependence of people with each other and all beings and all nature. And the nice thing about interdependence, though, is it's not just Buddhism or another spiritual philosophy, but now it's ever since the early 70s, it became a law of ecology. And that's really important because now scientists understand and talk about the importance of interconnectedness or interdependence and what it means. And especially it's important in studying climate science. So there are two other assumptions, though, in Buddhist economics. It's important when we think about what are the policies that form this economy. And these also are really diametrically opposed to mainstream or neoliberalism in sort of mainstream economics. So in mainstream economics, we know that people are selfish and just looking out for themselves and maximizing for themselves. Whereas in Buddhist economics, a really important assumption is that people are compassionate and altruistic, and they care about others as well as self-caring. But another assumption that's important in Buddhist economics, which is also opposite from mainstream economics, is that everything's always changing, that impermanence is how the world operates, that there's no such thing as an equilibrium point, which in mainstream economics is, of course, what every model solves for. So always we have to deal with impermanence, which it isn't bad. It's just how life is. As well as understanding, thankfully, people are altruistic and we're all interconnected. So I'd like to just pause for just a minute. This would really help me. And let's just take a few deep breaths because it really helps, I think, center our minds. And so as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, just we'll focus on breathing in and breathing out. Breathe in love. Breathe out love. Breathe in peace. Breathe out peace. And take a few more deep breaths and relax. And now we don't have to worry about anything except thinking about making the world a better place and talking to each other in a way that will help us hopefully move forward in our own thinking. So one of the ways that I think helps people think about sort of what's going on is that we know, for Buddhists at least, but I think most spiritual philosophies say that we have this outer wealth, which is usually thought of as physical or material life, as well as our inner wealth, which is our spiritual life. But for me, outer wealth is really our common outer wealth, or the environment, nature, that we all join together. And that to me is actually really important to think of that as wealth and something that's the common good for all of us and really is important to our own well-being and quality of life, not just as individuals, of course, but as communities, states, and nations. And it certainly goes beyond material possessions. So there are a couple of spiritual teachings that I like a lot that I'll let you read, but they really, to me, express really well how humans are treating nature and how we must stop. And that it's a human problem and humans must come together to stop the destruction of nature and the harm to beings and species. So one of the things in economics, Buddhist economics, that I have spent quite a bit of time on is alternative measures of economic performance or outcomes. And besides GDP, and why GDP is totally inadequate. Every economist will tell you. You can't find an economist that I know that would tell you GDP measures performance or quality of life. And even the founder of GDP said, don't think this measures well-being. No, this measures market output. And so one of the things that we want to move beyond is not measuring economic performance as GDP, but find ways to measure well-being. The problem is whenever I've been in a group of economists discussing this, each economist seems to have their own their sort of way of doing this. And so I spent a chapter comparing them and sort of each sort of way of aggregating to know how the economy is doing in terms of improving well-being or not. It's like they all have different ways that they want to do it, this room full of economists. And so we end up, instead of actually replacing the GDP or at least complementing it with a better measure of well-being, we end up sort of not doing anything, which to me is the worst outcome, but it is the state of where we are. Now, the main thing that I think I have to teach my students, and you all already know this, but it's really important, is that a lot of people think, oh, well, it's important for me to, have a low carbon footprint. But that won't solve the problem, because the problem is not what the individual is doing, although it matters. An individual should care. They should do everything they can to lower their own way of hurting the environment and healing nature. But that won't solve the problem, because the problem is that the energy systems that we're using globally are based upon fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And as long as we're burning coal, oil, and gas, we will be overheating the planet. CO2 lasts centuries in the air. Methane lasts only 30 years, but it's extremely hot. In that 30 years, it's 80 times hotter than CO2, carbon dioxide. So we have a serious problem if everybody's using fossil fuels. And the big problem is that they don't have good alternatives. It's not like they can say overnight, oh, well, I'll just quit using fossil fuels, or, oh, I'll quit using plastics. It's like, just a minute. You look around, and for most people, that's not a viable option. And so, or they'll say, oh, I'll find a way that we won't be using industrial agriculture. But just a minute, they go to the store, and almost everything there is produced by industrial agriculture. They can cut back on their meat consumption, especially beef and lamb, and some pork. But you know what? The problem is often they haven't figured out how to do that. And so they could do that individually, but it'd be much better if, at least while we're learning to be more plant-based in our foods, we could at least really force an agricultural system that's regenerative. And at least when there's livestock, it's humane and not causing the environmental damage as badly as it is. So we really do need to talk about transforming our national economic systems to stop climate change and to stop killing the planet. And then furthermore, to start healing the planet. So we know we have to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. We have to replace industrial agriculture with regenerative agriculture. And one of the things that's not talked about is ending wasteful consumption. So even now, when people are buying EVs in the US, they're buying these gigantic EVs instead of buying more energy efficient EVs, because it does matter how much electricity you're using. It must be clean electricity. And at the rate we're going, if we just try to replicate our lives, we don't have enough electricity, not to mention clean electricity. So that's where actually focusing on sort of GDP and telling people, oh, you don't have to change. You really don't. You can get an EV, and it's okay if it's still a Hummer or an SUV. And most of the vehicles rather, in the US are pickup trucks and SUVs, and they use a whole lot more energy than a compact EV. And so it's a problem that we aren't willing to actually talk about in most cases, because we don't want to upset people that they might have to rethink some of the ways that they're living. So how to create change? Now, I don't know how many of you are economists, but if you're a political scientist, this will sound somewhat simplistic, but to economists, we never think about how our market's structured. And those are just the rules and regulations that run markets. So all markets have rules and regulations. It's just the question of who structures them. And so in the US, when we say deregulate, we really mean turn over the rules and regulations to big business. And Steve Vogel and others in political science have done some great work on this, and I've learned a lot from them. The ones I'm talking about are many of them are at Berkeley, but not all. But anyway, big business runs the rules. You can already see it, not just in the tech sector, but in big oil. When big oil runs the energy markets as they do now, you can forget the common good. Because Exxon and Chevron and Shell and BP, they all say, hey, that's okay. We don't have to phase out fossil fuels. Everybody needs them. Everybody wants them. They're a critical part of our life. So all you have to do is capture carbon and sequester it. all you have to do is produce hydrogen. You can be blue hydrogen. It's okay. It doesn't have to be green hydrogen. Oh, hey, all you have to do is just have abated fossil fuels, which is what they said at the latest OPEC. Excuse me, not OPEC. The COP28. That's okay. We can keep using fossil fuels. We just have to capture the emissions and then sequester them. But that's not true. First of all, we haven't been able to do that. It's a failed technology. And blue hydrogen, if you look at the emissions and the energy used with fossil fuels over its life cycle, it's almost as bad in some cases as using coal. And in other cases, certainly no better than methane gas, which burns hot because it's using so much methane or natural gas. I don't use the word natural gas. It's somewhat misleading since it's methane. So what you do is you have governments making the rules and regulations for the common good. And that's both with market structure and working through markets, but also with social programs that set up the policies. And so I quickly talk about what policies affect market structures, taxes, regulations, financial system. So that's in the market, but equally important, the government has to provide goods and services for all so that the economy is, some things go through the marketplace, many things go through just direct provision for all: education, healthcare, a safety net, infrastructure, human rights, clean air, safe water, a livable planet. The government has to be providing those for everyone, and not just a few, and not just deciding, oh, we don't really need a safety net. We'll let people figure it out how to take care of themselves, which is almost what happens in the US. So we created the SSPI, as I mentioned, and it's really, I think of it as an economy that cares for all people on the planet. We have three pillars: sustainability, which protects our ecosystems; shared prosperity, which makes the economy and society much more equitable and provides well-being for all through a global perspective. It's not just a national perspective, that the rich countries have to really help the developing world or the lower resource countries develop their economies in a way that allows them to skip, jump, hop, leapfrog over fossil fuels and develop using clean energy. Also, if you look at sort of the emissions by country, you realize emissions are related to income and GDP, that the richer countries are over-consuming, and there's an enormous amount of wasteful consumption. And they need to reduce wasteful consumption, especially for the higher income people. The wasteful consumption of the top 10% across most rich countries is enormous compared to the median or bottom 40% even. And so we end up with three pillars: sustainability, market structure, public goods and service. And as I said, together they have about 60 policies. So one thing is that the nice thing about having a policy index is it's not pie in the sky. These are known policies. You can't have data unless you have policies that are known and are already in place. And of course, some countries have much better policy than others. But the whole point is we know how to reduce inequality. We have studied that for decades. We know some countries do it well and some countries don't bother with even trying to reduce policy. We already know from the Paris COP15 that the carbon-free energy roadmaps are available about how to create a carbon-free energy, renewable agriculture, and clean water. So we have those, even if it doesn't mean it's easy to do, we know we can do it. We have to be committed to making the investments and making them to get us through the transition to a carbon-free energy system, and ways that we stop causing death to the planet and in the environment. We also know how to reduce global suffering from the UN Millennium Development Goals that showed us how to reduce global hunger and poverty and educate women and girls. A lot of it is actually setting a goal with the determination of how can the higher income countries, once again, help the countries that don't have adequate resources to reach these goals without a lot of help with more resources that help them use them to reach the goal. So if you ask what's the SSPI rankings, as I said, the US is really low out of 50, and the top 10 are the European countries. The main country that comes in first outside of Europe is Japan, but Canada is way up there. I wish I had that with, they're not far behind Japan. The problem for me, and I think for you and the world, is that the sustainability policies are the weakest pillar. It's unfortunate. Countries are doing much better, say, in healthcare, education, creating roads that people use to drive their cars, even delivering water, getting sewage systems in. They're doing quite well in those areas, setting up internet systems, but they aren't doing well in basically moving to clean energy. The carbon emissions are too high across all countries. Countries are still using way too much fossil fuel energy and going too slow on creating renewable energy, wind, solar, small hydro, and so forth. Waste is too high. One of the UN reports every year show waste is so high across countries that people are over consuming, and then we already know about all the problems with plastics and the huge amount of plastics that we throw away and throw into the ocean and those problems. But also now one of the big concerns is groundwater, that we're overusing the groundwater, we're not protecting it, and pretty soon the groundwater is used not mostly by agriculture, but especially also for human drinking and use in cooking. And pretty soon there's cities, I know New Mexico City just said we're about to run out of drinkable water. Phoenix, Arizona, every year they say, oh my God, we're going to run out of drinkable water. And that is a huge deal because people have to have water. It's just an absolute essential part of life, as you know. I just want to point out that the US, actually, we're strongest in the financial sector. We have a great banking system. Okay, you got to have a banking system, but to have that be your strongest policy, I think is somewhat tragic. The US is really weak in greenhouse gases, actually in collecting taxes and progressivity of taxes, and they're especially weak in their global role. They haven't done well, especially under Trump. We did awful in even making our contribution to the UN and to the Green Fund for the developing world to be able to move to renewable energy. We've done a little better under Biden, but this data is all from 2018, and so that doesn't show up yet for the US. Even high-ranked countries, though, have to improve sustainability. And so I just point out some of the ways Denmark has a very low waste rank, meaning they're over consuming and not dealing well with their solid waste, and they don't recycle. So Denmark needs to be more regenerative. Sweden has a very low land rank. They have high deforestation and low carbon stock in their forest biomass, both. So that has to do with land use. And Japan has a very low energy and greenhouse gas rank because after their terrible earthquake and tsunami problem with their nuclear power plant, they shut down all of their nuclear power plants and went only to coal use and fossil gas use, but mainly coal instead of even gas. And that's really caused them some pollution problems, has made them rethink how to actually go back towards cleaner energy. So countries can learn from each other. One of the things I like about the SSPI is that it does give you a policy roadmap that countries can use to learn from each other and to compare countries. And so we can all, as people, we already know we all have weak points and strong points. It's also true of our countries. So there are, here's some of the major performance indices that actually track well with the SSPI, the Human Development Index, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Social Progress Indicator, the Legatum Prosperity Index, and then it doesn't actually track well with some of the environmental performance indices, except for one that's much, much broader, which is called the Environmental Performance Index out of Yale. But overall, it looks like policies do matter and lead to better performance in general. So that's it. I'd love to chat and talk with you for the time we have left. I was hoping to have at least 30 minutes, so it looks like we do. I just do want to remind you, though, that it takes a lot of courage to work together to create the economy that cares for all and for the planet. And also it takes courage to demand justice and human dignity. And it takes a lot of courage to live with joy. And so I think that's really important parts of our lives, is that as we work together, as a Buddhist, I know I can't just think about the goals that we're not making or how badly things are going, but to really understand everything is impermanent. We don't know the outcomes. The process is critical, where we care for each other and we do the best we can. We ask what's important and we work on the things that we're able to work on. And when things are good, we celebrate. When things are bad, we just pat each other on the back and say, well, big oil won that fight. I live by a major Chevron refinery, and for years, they've been able to get away with all kinds of policies that really hurt not just the planet, but the local community. And so we have to say, okay, at least we're out there working together and doing our best and really making a difference. And one thing I keep trying to tell groups is, actually it matters that we're making a difference. Even if it's not as big a difference as we need to make for future generations, it's a lot better than what might happen, how quickly we kill the earth or how quickly we cause things to be almost unlivable. It matters. It matters whether the increase in temperature is 0.18 or 4.8. And there's a big continuum, and it does matter what we're doing. So I'd love to hear what you're thinking about and sort of any question, any discussions. So Piero, I'll let you lead this, okay?
I'll be brief. First of all, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for creating this index that is monitoring policies throughout the world. I think this is great. And as you said, countries can learn from each other. If I can talk about my major concern, it comes from the 1970 Club of Rome and the limits to growth. And I think that one of the things that we should be measuring, or we should have policies about, is limiting growth. And, during my lifetime, Professor Brown, I'm 70 years old now. In 1953, when I was born, the population of the world was between 2.5 or 2.7 billion people. I don't have exactly the number. Now, during my lifetime, 7 decades, we are 8.1 billion people. Yeah. So yeah, there's not groundwater. Why there's not groundwater? Well, people are occupying deserts because there are too many people living in inadequate places. We are expanding agriculture and irrigating places where possibly it wouldn't be a place to have agriculture to begin with. And this is all driven, everything is driven by the growth in population. So, you know what, one thing that we should look, and nobody talks about this actually, our obsession with growth, right? Uh, I would say nobody talks because it's almost like we are oblivious to it. We are immersed in this culture of growth. We need to do more, we need to have more, and we're very good at survival. So I know I am talking too much, but I'm very passionate about this, that perhaps you know what happened in China recently, that the population in China went down, and Deng Xiaoping said, well, women have to start procreating more because this is important for our economy. Shouldn't you, so I'm challenging you, Professor Brown, who am I? I'm a bold man challenging you. Look at policies that limit growth. Are there such policies out there? Are there policies that limit human growth, population growth? Probably there
Right.
are.
Yeah. So I want you to know that one of the policies in the SSPI is, these are policies now, women's access to birth control. Because I mean, when women have access to birth control, and then other policies relate to adequate food for people and food systems and so forth. Those are other policies, but when you bring together people have adequate resources to have a comfortable life, and women have complete access to birth control, then you can look at the countries that have adequate resources and birth control, and women are not reproducing adequately to reproduce numbers. And one of the things I say in Buddhist economics, after I praise the Pope and Laudato Si, I say the problem is their population does matter. And we already know that the American standard of living requires 4 Earths, 4, and we only have 1. And so one of the things that I point out and care a great deal about is if we want to have global prosperity where we share resources globally, then we definitely have to reduce population growth, because you can't, as you point out, have as many people as we have and provide everybody a comfortable life. We don't have those resources. We don't have to provide these so-called materialism of the United States. But if you do want to think that we want enough people only to have a comfortable life for everyone, and of course access to birth control, then it's like the U.S. is going the other way. As you know, we're already trying to take away abortion rights and access to women having control over their bodies in the U.S. Fortunately, other countries are not following us, but those are only like the European countries. One of the biggest problems in Africa is women don't have birth control, and a lot of them don't even know what causes birth. So one of the things that Amartya Sen, whom I greatly admire, worked with the group to actually train women in communities around African countries to go in and teach young girls what causes you to get pregnant. And then coupled that with providing them with like some ways to have more sustainable farming for themselves, so that they could also feed themselves better. But I thought it was great that he understood you got to teach these women what makes you pregnant and what can you do to not get pregnant. Because
Very
as you
good.
know, the population growth in Southern Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is enormous. It's really high. And that goes through into the Middle East. So that if you look where the population is growing, it's Southern Africa and Middle East. I think one of the reasons we don't talk about it too much, as you say, or nearly enough, is we're afraid that it might sound racist. It certainly goes against some religious beliefs, but it's also, there's some racial differences, but they reflect income and access to healthcare.
Correct.
So
We have two people raise their hands. Paul first,
Yeah, I
and
was when I
then
was listening to you, I was thinking all the time about the country of Bhutan. Instead of measuring gross national product, they measure gross national happiness,
Right.
which is, and actually in 2008, they adopted GNH as part of their constitution. So it's almost like the constitution guarantees happiness for the Bhutanese population through education, healthcare, opportunities for women, all communities. Actually, the tourism motto for the country of Bhutan is happiness is a place. Now, how beautiful is that? So when you were talking about Buddhist economy, I was thinking about Bhutan and GNH. So that's a comment. And I have a question for you. How close you think is US economy closer to Buddhist economy?
Oh, well, it's night and day.
Yeah,
There,
exactly. That's what I thought.
if you have two Venn diagrams, they don't touch as far as I can tell.
Okay.
But I've been to Japan and given talks there, and have been in. I'm in touch with them and invited there. One of the and I love Bhutan. It's a beautiful sacred place.
Mhm.
But they're the way they set up GNH, their gross national happiness isn't transferable. It's very much reflects their local customs
Yeah.
and what they think is important for living, which is great. And so that it's not something that, say, Finland or Norway would be adopting with still the same goals. You can have the same goals, but one of the things about the Bhutan is that it's like how many people know how to do a certain dance? And I know the national sport there is archery, and my husband actually does Bhutanese archery because of our visit there. He was already an archer, but Bhutanese archery is you have to shoot 150 yards. And people everywhere you go, no matter how small the hamlet or town is, they have an archery range. It's wonderful. And so the
Actually,
other,
yeah,
go ahead.
Buddhism is actually the official religion of Bhutan, and 75% of Bhutanese are Buddhists. So that may have something to do with it. The connection.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. And let me just say though that unfortunately, when they did their first survey and they surveyed every single person in the country the first time to see how they would rank on their survey for the happiness, national gross happiness. So unfortunately, like 30% of the people weren't happy. And that really upset them. The people who were all happy actually tended to be monks or highly educated people. And the people who weren't happy, as you might expect, were people in rural areas who didn't have enough resources. And so they said, oh, we need to figure out how to raise happiness of the people who are not happy, really aren't happy and need to be if we care about it. We need to. So I like the idea of equality of happiness. And so that's sort of what I think you're getting at, the quality of happiness, and we want to grow happiness. And what we might say in a more Western world is sort of equality of well-being, where we define well-being in all the ways that we think make people healthy and educated and happy and fulfilling their full potential and giving them the time to be part of the community and contribute to the community, as well as take care of their families. So there are ways that we can talk about well-being and performance, even if it doesn't have to be quite as detailed in a Buddhist way for Bhutan. But thank you for bringing up Bhutan. I love Bhutan.
Dan, and then Chris.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you, first of all, for the book Buddhist Economics, which I started assigning to students, I think, within a year of its publication. So I got
Thank you.
through that a number of times. And now for the SSPI, which, you know, it strikes me as a good improvement on all the other indices that you know, you analyzed in that other book. And anyway, I was just thinking, you know, when I'm thinking about the kind of policies that we're talking about, would Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren have been our first Buddhist president? I mean, because, you know, their 2020 platforms are basically, it seems to me, virtually identical to the sorts of policies that you think that we ought to have. And I was thinking about one thing in particular. I was aware that I think in 2018, Warren introduced a bill, which had no chance of passage, of course, called the Accountable Capitalism Act. And I'm just wondering what you thought about some of these provisions. Like, one of them is that employees would elect 40% of a board of directors of any corporation that had more than $1 billion in tax receipts. That 75% of shareholders would have to approve of any political spending. And that corporations with the revenue over 1 billion would be required to obtain a federal corporate charter. And there would have to be in this charter, you know, provision for general public benefit, you know, for corporations. I mean, let's just suppose in an ideal world that this bill could be taken seriously and passed. Is this, you know, would this make a big difference?
Oh, I think there are lots of ways that we could make a huge difference in making the American economy work better. And I love Elizabeth Warren. My son was in charge of her tech when she was running for president. And I follow her quite closely. But you don't even have to, look, you don't have to go back very far. The United States used to have progressive taxation. And when it did, it had a huge difference in inequality. When you tax at the margin 80 to 90% of people's income, meaning high income CEOs or entertainers, then all of us, they realized, you know, why do I care about income? Because I'm going to give most of it to the government. And so CEOs used to brag in the 50s about how close their pay was to their workers' pay. And that's for a good reason. Otherwise, they're working for the government, as they should be if they want to make too much money. So I would really like to have highly progressive taxes again. And I would really like to find all kinds of ways to do some of the things you mentioned, but you know, it's really simple to have high progressive taxes if you can pass them. And then once you do that, the impact, if you look at pre-1980, it was Ronald Reagan that came in and said, you know, everybody in America has enough money, so people should have more control over their money, because as long as everybody has enough, then when they're making more, let them take better vacations or let them do whatever. And then he brought out, remember that horrible time that he brought out the welfare queen? And it said, look, we have a safety net. See, you don't, if you're not working or whatever, you have enough money because we have a safety net. And so on that basis, he said, so therefore we're going to dramatically lower the taxes. And they did over time. And the minute he did that, then all of a sudden, I hate to even go to Silicon Valley, which is not far away, because when I do, I hear these really super rich men bragging about how big their yachts are. I even heard them bragging a couple of years ago. They were bragging about what great wine openers they had. Look, I have this $800 wine opener, and look what it does. And I'm thinking, excuse me? Like, why in the world would anyone think that that's something that they should discuss and brag about? They should feel ashamed of themselves. And this was when workers' wages were not going up. And so I think there are lots of ways that we could improve the system. But one on SSPI, I put up progressivity in tax revenues, because I think that's really important. But I love Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and I wish that we could take back the House and then keep the Senate and the White House and hope that we could get more progressive. Because
Beautiful.
right now, we don't have enough power.
We're gonna hear from, thank you. We're gonna hear from Chris and then Ivan.
So let me second what my brother-in-law Dan said about your work. I've been reading it online. I haven't read your book yet, but I can tell I'm going to love it. I was asked by Richard Mattson just a few years ago to contribute the Buddhism chapter on a book called Economic Inequality and Morality, Diverse Ethical Perspectives. And my chapter is called Economic Justice in the Buddhist Tradition. And I'm happy to say that even without the benefit of your book, the engaged Buddhists, many of whom you read and quote and so on, all come to the same conclusions that you do in your talks. So, I mean, this is just a wonderful thing that Buddhism, which traditionally is focused on individual morality and whose institutional profile in Asia is one of great wealth accumulation and not real focus on justice per se. It's not a concept in ancient Buddhism of fairness or justice. It's the wealthy man, as long as he got his money legally and was generous, was the most highly respected person in society, traditionally in Buddhism. But now with Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. Ambedkar and so many, His Holiness, so on, we now have many of the economic perspectives that you're talking about. So it's just kind of an exciting time, I think, for Buddhist ethics. And to have practitioners like yourself who are highly placed in the economics field, really helping people in your area in social sciences to understand what Buddhism can contribute, I think is a great thing. I had just a couple of quick questions. You can maybe just tick them off really fast. One of my great heroes is Joanna Macy, and she used systems theory, which I studied and did my doctoral work in systems theory, for her understanding of how Buddhism, how individuals in society relate to each other. And I just wondered if you read her and whether you think her systems theory is helpful. A couple of other people, of course, E.F. Shoemaker, whom you do mention, who wrote that first important essay on Buddhist economics years and years ago. You've gone way beyond anything he said in that essay, which is great. But I wonder what you think about your colleague Robert Reich at Berkeley and his economics, whether Buddhist economics could be considered socialism, or whether some of your critics say, oh, this is just warmed over socialism. And finally, kind of unrelated to all those questions, is you mentioned nuclear power and what happened in Japan after the tsunami. Well, you know, France has been using nuclear power safely for decades now, and nobody, progressives do not want to talk about that because nuclear power is anathema. And I'm just wondering what percentage of our green future you feel should be occupied by nuclear power. So that's a lot of different things. I apologize, but
That
you
is
can
a
just
lot of
kind of
different things. I
comment
love
quickly on any of them.
I love Joanna Macy. She's not far from me here in this area.
Yes.
And her work's been extremely valuable. I really like David Lloyd's work. I would look forward to reading your essay. He's written some great books on ecodharma, and how to bring it about. And he says it in this way: look, this is an existential crisis right now with what's happening to killing the planet. And so if Buddhists can't get off their sofa, their cushion, and go out and work as engaged Buddhists, then Buddhism isn't what we need right now. He says it that strongly, and there are quite a few people who agree with that. I think nuclear power is somewhat controversial because of the problems with caring for waste, but also with earthquakes. So like in California, any place you have earthquakes, you really don't want to have nuclear power. So it cares a lot about the context. But not only does France keep nuclear power, Germany rather decided to get rid of all nuclear power after Japan. And so France actually has much dirtier energy now. It's a difficult situation. So if we're in countries like India, where you have areas where you could possibly have nuclear power, but you need to figure out how to make it safe, and then how to actually have the funds to use it or to actually build it. So I think it's got to be part of the mix, just because we need every single tool we have right now that's clean, that's equitable, that can help move us ahead, and doesn't keep killing the planet. So we do need to be careful about anything we use, such as we found out, we used to think hydro was great, but then we found out actually big hydro and dams is actually causing enormous environmental problems. And so Bhutan, one of the things I loved about Bhutan is they have really great technology that's hydro, because they have they have tons of mountains with water coming out, and they have waterfalls everywhere. So they have their electricity is from hydro coming out of mountains from little generators. And they have so much of it that they sell it to India, and it's their main export to India, which they need. They need that export to India because they have imports from India. But, there are all kinds of ways that we could explore from other countries, such as small hydro. But we have to be really careful about it and consider unseen or unintended consequences. So everything you said has great points. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
Go ahead, Ivan, please. Ivan.
Hello, thank you so much for your so interesting presentation. My question is very short. What do you think about economic degrowth? There's a movement in Europe, a little bit in, fringe socialist in Canada as well, because especially for rich countries like ours, so we can let the poorer, so-called poorer countries come up a little bit. But the general theme of economic degrowth, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm all for having us really reduce overconsumption and wasteful consumption, which I think is a big part of degrowth, and actually reducing inequality would dramatically reduce consumption and wasteful consumption. And so I'm a little careful about using the word degrowth because it's taken so negatively. That's why I want to really focus on stop being materialistic in how you're thinking about the economy and your well-being, and stop using GDP, which is all about growing in the marketplace and everything that you said. And instead, let's focus on well-being. How well are people? How are they getting enough education and health care and public safety and caring for each other in the ways they need to? They have enough time off from work to be with their families and their communities. It's like, we know what people need and what makes them happy and healthy. And it's not more consumption in most countries. There are countries, though, that do need more consumption and all the things we just said. And so I agree with you that it's absolutely essential to reduce inequality and have reduce wasteful consumption, which means basically less consumption in the rich countries so that the poor countries can have basic consumption. But I don't use the word degrowth. I use the word well-being. And to me, because nobody's going to go against well-being. They may not agree what well-being is, but they aren't going to go against it. So thank you.
I just want to interject. Claire, it's interesting. I had the same feeling when people start saying defund the police. It's the same feeling with degrowth and defund. Do you remember that? Yeah. Dan.
I know it's getting late, so this is kind of a small question. A few days ago, sort of in your neighborhood, on the deck of the USS Hornet, which is docked at Alameda, they set up a machine to spray fine particles of salt water into the air to brighten clouds. So it's one of the many ways that geoengineering might be used to help us solve our problem. Just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I got to tell you, at Berkeley, I go to a climate economics seminar, and you wouldn't believe the number of papers coming from PhD students about geoengineering. And it's all about focusing on what's the outcome in global warming of the atmosphere. What's the impact on the growth of overheating or cooling off the atmosphere? And I am the only person in the room that raises my hand and says, first of all, they don't know if it works. But secondly, and of course it's very expensive, but I rose my hand and say, what about all the unintended consequences about what happens to the environment and to people and to all the beings when these things come down to earth in some way, or when they destroy life in the oceans, because many of them are about how to do geoengineering the ocean. The unintended consequences are ignored, and they just tell you this is what will happen to the temperature in the atmosphere. And I think that I'm really happy they're super expensive and haven't been proven, because fortunately, if the cost is high enough, it won't happen. But I think that it scares me to death when I go to these seminars and nobody's talking about the actual impact on the environment. Not to mention,
We deposit too much hope in our inventiveness, our ingenuity, that technology is going to get us out of the predicament that we have created. And so we are very good at promoting our solutions, but we don't talk too much about the collateral damage that these solutions may bring about.
That's right. And the current one that's a false solution to all the environmentalists that I work with in California is carbon capture. That somehow all we do is capture carbon from smokestacks or direct air even capturing. And then somehow we're going to magically put it underground and it's going to stay there and not cause problems. It's like, and fortunately it's super expensive, but the governments are now paying for it. They're paying the companies for it. And same with blue hydrogen. All of a sudden it's like, oh, we can do hydrogen and that will take care of a lot of our problem. And those are actually somewhat benign compared to geoengineering. So we have to keep coming back to lower emissions. That's our #1 goal from a climate perspective. Quit using fossil fuels and use clean energy. And we can do that. The technology's there. We know it's safe. We know the consequences. We want to transition to a clean energy economy across the world. And that needs to be, for me, the policies that we really focus on in climate.
Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Brown. We have a little ritual when we finish our sessions. We go around and we say one word that encapsulates our feelings. It's kind of our final words. And I call people as I look at the squares. So if you are game, I would like to do this before we end the session today. So let's start with Nancy and then Dan.
First of all, many, many thanks, Professor Brown. It's been wonderful. Reading your book was wonderful. And then to have the experience of listening and chatting with you has just been great. I guess my thought, I can never narrow down to one word, but I like the SSPI and being able to rate the unintended consequences of some of the great ideas that we're coming up with. Yes.
Very good. Thank you, Dan, and then Ivan.
If we'd had more time, I would have asked about carbon tax. So I'll leave it with that.
Okay. We probably would have to have another meeting. Ivan and then Chris.
Insight and wisdom.
Insight and wisdom. Chris and then Reagan.
Thank you for inviting us to breathe, because if we're not careful, we won't be able to breathe the air on this planet. And so breath is such a gift. And you, as an economist, reminding us to breathe is brilliant.
Thank you.
Reagan and then Paul.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Brown. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for PRO for organizing. And Chris, I'll piggyback on you and bring David Loy full circle here and say, I will never forget when he said, if you ever doubt your interdependence, hold your breath for 4 minutes and let me know how that goes.
Very good.
That's a good
Much gratitude.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm the stray who just happened to come into this place tonight. But thank you for inviting me, Piero, and thank you, Dr. Professor Brown. And it's wonderful that this happened during the celebration of Earth Day coming up on April 22nd. So this is very relevant and timely. And I have 2 words, is healthy socialism.
Healthy socialism. Very good. And are you able to, I see that you are there. I don't know if you can unmute yourself and if you want to say something. I'll wait 5 seconds. I don't think that Anne is able. What I have in my heart right now, it's again, limits to growth. I think we need to bring back that discussion of the 1970s of the Club of Rome. I think that's an important discussion that is not happening right now. To bring more conscience to this, really, the way that we have been reproducing and growing the human population with all the unintended consequences. Professor Brown, what would be your final words for tonight?
I would first of all say thank you. So one of my final words is gratitude for all you're doing, for all your caring for each other and for the earth and your activism. It's really important. So I love seeing you and hearing you and learning from you. And then my other word is courage. We must never lose our courage along with our joy in our daily life, because it's what keeps us going and working with each other. And every single thing that we do to help the planet and help other people and beings is important. It's like,
Beautiful.
yes.
Thank you. Anne, you came alive. So
I came alive. My son came and rescued me from being unable to unmute myself. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed the first half. I loved reading your book, Claire. Thank you so very much. And I'm just going to say what you've left me with is a feeling of calm and reasonableness. So thank you for that.
Very good. So if you want to join me, we bring our hands together to express gratitude to one another for showing up, for being here, for kind of practicing together. And we know that although this practice is beneficial to us, we also know that our practice is not selfish. We do not practice for ourselves alone. We know that our practice benefits the entire world. So we bow to each other with gratitude, saying thank you for your practice. The Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
May I add
Goodbye.
one mantra?
Sure.
Say often, may we heal the earth as we heal ourselves for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.